scene is going to take us from around 197 BC to 70 AD. It covers an awful lot of history. And what it's really going to be dealing with is the final overthrow of the Grecian Empire and pagan Rome coming into its ascendancy in a strong and powerful way. So this first term of the verse, when it says, "But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him," is dealing with pagan Rome. The he is dealing with pagan Rome that cometh against him. The him in that verse is dealing with Greece. Okay, and when I mean Greece, it's going to deal with both phases of Greece, both the Macedonian part and the Syrian part. It's going to be dealing with both of those areas. So it starts in 197, which kicks off this warfare. And in 197, Rome defeated the Macedonians in a warfare. When we spoke about that yesterday, it was the 5th Syrian War, where they went to where they had battle with one another. The more significant date after 197 is 168 BC. Okay, 168 BC, there was another war which was entered by Rome and Greece. This is Greece as we know it, that land area now. And in 168, there was the Battle of Pydna. And the Battle of Pydna, the conclusion of that battle, really decided, finally, that Greece was in subjugation to Rome, and it became a territory, if you like, of the Roman Empire. Now, 168 is the date that we normally use for the transfer of power from Greece to pagan Rome. But it's not the complete work of that transfer of power. But what I want to mark this point is, remember we said the King of the North is represented by Greece and Syria. Remember that? Okay, it's represented by Greece and Syria. And the King of the South is Egypt. Where was Alexander's power base? In Greece. It wasn't Syria, was it? Okay. So when we talk about the King of the North, this idea of being the King of the North, when Rome takes over this territory, it takes over the title for King of the North. So the reason why 168 is important is because at this time period, Rome becomes the King of the North. Rome becomes the King of the North in 168 BC. The reason why that's important to understand is because you'll find that a power, and we're going to address this quickly hopefully, are people familiar that pagan Rome had to destroy 3 areas before it became the world power? Okay, if you're not familiar with that history, most of us, if not all of us, should be familiar that papal Rome, according to Daniel chapter 7, had to destroy 3 horns. We had the 10 horns of Daniel 7, he had to destroy 3 of them. We're all familiar with that. So you know that papal Rome had to destroy 3 powers but to become powerful. Okay, you'll find, and we'll go over this quickly, that pagan Rome before that had to do the same thing. And in both of those histories, you'll find that both of those powers become the King of the North before they attack the 3 territories. Before they attack the 3 territories, they already have the title for King of the North. So that's why 168 is important. 168 isn't the defeat of Grecian Empire, but it marks when Rome, pagan Rome in this instant, becomes the King of the North. Does that make sense? Okay, so Greece was the King of the North, and now pagan Rome is King of the North. Even though it's got the title of King of the North, it still hasn't destroyed this part of Greece. There's still this part to deal with, but it has received the title. 73, 74. Okay, we're still in verse 16. We're going to jump a large amount of history now, and we're going to come down to 63 BC. So we've jumped a long time. We've come to 63 BC, and now we've come to the 30th king of Syria, or the king of the north, who used to be the king of the north, but I'm not going to use that term now, I'm going to use Syria. Okay? We've come to the 30th king of the Syrian Empire. Remember we were listing 1, 2, 3, we've got down to about 6 or 7, now we're at the 30th. We've come right down to the end of the Syrian Empire. 63 BC, Rome instigates a campaign against its eastern enemies, including Syria, and that campaign was between 73 BC and 63 BC. And at the end of the campaign in 63 BC, the general of Rome, whose name was Pompey, went into Syria and subjugated the land. Okay, so the king of all this territory here now, this part of Greece, is all taken over and destroyed by 63 BC. And all of that occurs in verse 16. It goes from 197 to 168 and 63 BC. And they're the two key dates that we need to understand. This date and this date. We're going to come back to this in a moment, okay? The last part of the verse says, and he shall stand in the glorious land. We're in verse 16. So pagan Rome is going to stand in the glorious land. In this same campaign, actually, I've given you a wrong date here. It should actually be 64 BC. So that happens in 64 BC, not 63. In the same campaign, the following year, in 63 BC, that should be 63, that's the campaign, and in 64 BC he takes down Syria, and in 63 BC he stands in the glorious land, and the glorious land is Israel or Palestine. The he is the king of the north, who is Rome. Pagan Rome at this stage. He became pagan Rome. Pagan Rome became the king of the north in 168 BC. Throughout the verses, all the pronouns almost invariably, I think 100% of the time actually, talk about the king of the north or the king of the south. In fact, they are all the time in the chapter, it's always dealing with the king of the north or the king of the south. And when he says he, so first of all he comes against the Grecia, this part of the empire, in 197, 168. Then he deals with Syria in 64 BC, and at the same time he then subjugates Israel, who had been in subjection to Greece up to this stage. So now we can see that Israel is now in subjection from Greece into Rome, into the Roman power. He became a king of the north before he conquered the sea. Yes, you need to understand that he becomes a king of the north before he takes down the 3 territories. So how did he have those territories taken down? He takes it down because, remember, this idea of the king of the north, even though we were dealing, when we dealt with the 4 generals, we're dealing with mostly the Syrian part and the Egyptian part, and it's termed from the king of the north because it was Syria and Babylon, remember? This actual empire starts off from Greece or from Macedonia. So that's where, because that's the source of it, when he takes down this part of the empire, that's what qualifies him to do that. Okay? It's rather complex, but it's important to see that, and we're not going to address it today because there's a lot of study to that. When you come to papal Rome, and when it receives the title of the King of the North, if you don't see this complexity here, it gets even more complex, and the significance of Papal Rome when it receives its title. The Papal Rome receives its title for the King of the North before it takes down its 3 horns. Okay? And I'll give you the date of that because it's in this chapter. So we've come to the very last part of the verse. It says, which by his hand shall be consumed. So this is the last part of verse 16. The his is the King of the North, pagan Rome. So when it says, which by his hand shall be consumed, it's talking about the idea before that, when it's talking about the glorious land. So he enters the glorious land in 63 BC, and then the glorious land, it says, will be consumed or destroyed. So this destruction takes you down to AD 70. So we got down to AD 70, where where the nation of Israel is then destroyed as a nation. Sorry? Yes, the nation of Israel essentially crumbles at that stage. So I'm going to erase all of this. We're into verse 17. Before I carry on, I hope you remember yesterday that we said from verse 16 to verse 22 is covering the same history from verse 23 to verse 29/30. We'll get there. There might be some overlap on that. But this is covering the same time frame really. And they're both dealing with pagan Rome. Does everybody remember we went through that? Okay? The theme of this one, which is the one we're dealing with now, it has a theme that I've kind of entitled it. It's talking about how Rome rises and punishes or destroys God's people. That's the theme of what we're talking about now. From 16 to 22, yes. That's the theme of it. I'll give you the theme for the second part. Of the history there. Yes?
According to the 25:20, so it's Rome punishing Israel.
Yes.
And according to the rules, it's Islam punishing people Rome.
I'm going to say yes to your question, but there's more reasons behind. When you talk about the woes, there's more history or there's more concepts behind the issue of the woes than I'm addressing here. There's reasons behind the woes and the 7 trumpets. So I'm not going to go into Revelation.
No, I didn't want to go on that. I just wanted to see.
The reasoning behind the woes is different to this. So this theme here is, I'm going to have to, again, how Rome rises, but instead of dealing with the punishment of God's people, it's dealing with and how he is destroyed or overcome. So this one's talking about how he rises and punishes God's people, and this one is dealing how he rises and how he's eventually destroyed. They're the two themes, and you'll see that when we go through the verses. There's a difference between the two. He is destroyed. How Rome rises and how he is destroyed. So I've changed pens and it's a bit thinner, this one. Pagan Rome. They're both pagan Rome, and it's covering the same time frame. Pagan Rome. How pagan Rome rises, punishes God's people, and this theme is dealing with how he rises and is destroyed. So it goes back into history, into verse, when you get to verse 23. And we'll see that as we go through. So in verse 17,